Shabbat Shalom and good morning. Welcome. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville. Thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to kick off with this bit of information. Members of our studio audience can get your map today. So the maps are on the table after the class. You can grab those. We won't be needing them today, but they are printed. And for those of you who are watching, we're not going to do this on Shabbat. I'll announce it later. But I did get the tubes in the mail to mail these so that they safely arrive at your home, at your office. And I'm excited about this. So I'm really looking forward to sending those out. But I'll announce that and get into that later. I just wanted to say the maps are here, and hopefully I'll be able to get those out soon. One other announcement, one other thing that I want to talk about is that, God willing, this coming Thursday, I will be headed across the pond, as we say. I'll be going to join Dr. James Tabor. He'll be leading a tour. I'm the coordinator. I'll be working behind the scenes, and I'm looking forward to that. I get to spend quite a few days with Dr. Tabor in the land. Now, what that means for all of you is that this coming Saturday, the Sabbath morning here is after Shabbat in Israel, but we will be on a bus. I've looked carefully at the itinerary. We'll be on a bus with 35 people going to a destination, and it doesn't work that I teach next Saturday. But have no fear, because David and Patty Tyler have agreed to cover for me, at least for that class. So we'll announce more on that. We'll post that in the next few weeks. Now, we have an exciting, we'll talk about that in the next week, but we have an exciting lineup over the next 5 weeks because we'll be doing some teaching on location. Not only is Dr. Tabor going to be in that lineup, but obviously I'll be teaching. I'll be with Jono, I'll be with Rabbi Tovia Singer, and we have quite a bit planned over the next 5 weeks while I'm away. Yes, 5 weeks. October 20th to November 22nd is when I arrive back in the U.S., and that's because I have 3 tours back-to-back. The Tabor Nichols tour, the THAT Torah of Israel, and then the THAT Torah of Jordan. Now, by the way, we still have, and this is absolutely last minute, last chance, last call. If you wanted to join the THAT Torah of Israel and Jordan, Jono tells me that he absolutely must turn in everything to the tour operator by the 17th of October. So if you decided that you wanted to join us on the Israel or the Jordan or both, you can do that, but you absolutely have to sign up. Did I say absolutely enough? Underline it. Write it in your notes. October 17th is the deadline. Look, follow us closely because we're going to be going live on Facebook, on YouTube, and I'll try to publish a schedule so it's a little bit easier to find us, so you don't just have to sit by your phone and wait for us to go live. You can do other things. But no, I really hope that we're able to share some wonderful things with you, some on-location filming, because we want to, as best we can, provide the trip for you if you can't go, either physically or financially. We want to bring the trip to you, and so that's what we intend to do over the next 30 days, actually. But that begins Thursday. Today, welcome. Today is the season finale, I guess you could say, for a series that's been going for 1 year. 1 year, a year-long study that we've been participating in, you've been part of, called The Pentateuch, A New Look. The Pentateuch, A New Look. And what we did in that, as you know, is we did a deep dive. We began in the book of Genesis with the annual cycle of Torah readings, and we work through week by week by week, looking at the material of the Pentateuch in a way that many of you perhaps haven't looked at it before. And I think that we've covered quite a bit in the past year. All of those have been recorded and posted. They're available on demand in the archive as video and audio teachings, and you know where to find those. And so today is the season finale. It's the end of the law, folks. How many of you have heard of the end of the law? Not in the way that you might have learned about it in your childhood, but we have reached the end of the Pentateuch. In fact, last week, I sort of wrapped things up early. Now, I wrapped things up early because I did a class on the death of Moses, and we talked about that. You probably all heard that teaching. Now, according to the traditional method of working through the annual cycle of readings, the Jewish people don't reach the end of the Torah technically until THAT Torah. On THAT Torah, which is Tuesday of this week, this coming Tuesday, part of the THAT Torah service, the rejoicing of the Torah, the scroll, the end of Deuteronomy, the very end of Deuteronomy is read, and then the congregation rolls the scroll all the way back through Deuteronomy, Numbers, Leviticus, Exodus, Genesis, and get to Genesis 1:1, and they conclude with the reading of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. And what that does is it shows a continuity, that the Torah is never ending. It's always a cycle. You go from the end, Moses dies, you go all the way back to the beginning. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. You begin again. Now, part of the love and affection that the Jewish people have for the Torah comes out in that. And also, by the way, we are in the time of Sukkot. Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot, is winding down. And one of the things that the Bible commands in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 10 through 13, Moses issues a command, and he says that every 7 years during the festival of Sukkot, in the year of release, right, every 7th year, the children of Israel are to gather together and they're to publicly read the Torah. And so that was an established practice. Now, we get very little evidence of that taking place. I've talked about the few episodes where there's a possibility that that's what's going on, particularly Ezra and Nehemiah. We have our own Hebrew Torah reading team, and they are going through that during the festival of Sukkot every year. They don't wait for the 7th year. They do it every year. They read through the entirety of the Pentateuch from Genesis 1 through Deuteronomy 34:12, and they read it in Hebrew continuously. And it takes them about 20-plus hours to do that, 20-plus hours. But we're not going to do that today, so you're going to get out of here sooner than that. But I think that having worked through some challenging things over the past year, I want to put sort of an underline on one of the key points. Because you might say, wow, we've been through a lot over the past year. What's the main point? What are you telling me? What do I need to take from this year-long study? And so I decided to do it this way. According to the Jewish people, Moses wrote the Torah. Christians believe that Moses wrote the law. Most English Bibles, particularly Christian Bibles, will say, when you open up to Genesis, it'll say Genesis, the first book of Moses. Exodus, the second book of Moses. Leviticus, third. Deuteronomy, fourth. Numbers, fourth. Deuteronomy, fifth. These, according to the people of the book, are what Moses wrote. So Jews believe Moses wrote the Torah. Christians believe Moses wrote the law, and I believe that Moses wrote the Torah. I do. I believe that Moses wrote the Torah, and I have to believe that Moses wrote the Torah because Scripture tells me so. And I base everything that I believe on Scripture. So Scripture tells me that Moses wrote the Torah. The textual evidence is there, not only in the 5 books, particularly Deuteronomy, but throughout the Hebrew Bible. So I feel like it's necessary for me to tell you and to prove to you from the text that Moses indeed wrote the Torah. This today is that evidence. Get your pens ready, get your pads ready, and we're going to start. There are different names for the Torah that Moses wrote, and this is every text. So like usual, if you've followed with me for a while, you know I go through a lot of text. I decided, as painstaking as it might be, I'm going through every text. There are 1,000 of them. There's not really 1,000. It feels like 1,000. But we're going to go through every text that says that Moses wrote the Torah. The first designation is Sefer ha-Torah. It means the scroll of instruction. Sefer ha-Torah, scroll of instruction. It's mentioned 10 times. Here are those texts. And I put them in order. Now, here we go. I want you to go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 61. Also, every sickness and every plague which are not written in the book of this law, Sefer ha-Torah, the Lord will bring on you until you are destroyed. Now, you say, well, that doesn't say Moses wrote it. Stick with me. I'm going to give you every reference to the book that Moses wrote, whether or not he is mentioned in the text. Look at chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, 29 verse 20. I just want you to have these. The Lord will not be willing to forgive. Let me make sure that I'm in the right place. Some of these, now I did not go through every one of these. Okay, yeah, here we go. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him, but rather the anger of the Lord and his wrath will burn against that person, and every curse that is written in this book will lie upon him, and the Lord will wipe out his name from under heaven. Now I want you to notice that a couple of these, if you hear something, make yourself a note. This indicates that in this book of the law that Moses wrote, this Sefer ha-Torah, there are curses. Notice the curse that is written in this book, okay? Now look at chapter 30, Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 10. And by the way, I'll have commentary after these verses, so stay with me. If you obey the Lord your God, chapter 30, verse 10 of Deuteronomy, to keep his commandments and his statutes which are written in this book of the law, Sefer ha-Torah. If you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. Now go down to chapter 31 and verse 26. 31 verse 26. And it says, take this book of the law and place it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, so that it will remain there as a witness against you. Go to Joshua 1:8. One thing that a teacher has to be able to do is sense the audience. And right now I'm sensing that you're thinking this is going to be too much. What I won't do is necessarily read them all, but I'll give you these references, and of course John will have these typed up as well. This book of the law, Sefer ha-Torah hazeh, shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that's written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will achieve success. Again, Joshua 1:8. This Sefer ha-Torah, we're talking about the manuscript, I shouldn't call it manuscript, the document that Moses produced, Sefer ha-Torah. Joshua 8 and verse 34. Then afterwards he read all the words of the law. And afterwards he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, there it is again, according to everything that is written in the book of the law, Sefer ha-Torah. 2 Kings 22. These are all the mentions of this document, and it's why I believe that Moses wrote it. 2 Kings 22:8. Now, what you'll notice is that this is about the discovery of this document. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law, Sefer ha-Torah, Matzati. I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the scroll, or the book, the Sefer, to Shaphan, who read it. Look down at verse 11. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, the scroll of the law, he tore his clothes, Sefer ha-Torah. Nehemiah. Go to Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 3. And he read from it before the public square, which was in front of the water gate, from early morning until midday, in the presence of men and women and those who could understand, and all the people were attentive to the Sefer ha-Torah. What I want to demonstrate is that under this title, the writers of the Bible, the authors of the text, knew of this document, the Sefer ha-Torah. And then the final, I'm not going to read, just put in your notes, 2 Chronicles 34:15. 2 Chronicles 34:15. Now the next phrase by which this document is known is Sefer Moshe, the scroll of Moses. So we have the scroll of the Torah, the scroll of the instruction, and we have the scroll of Moses. It's mentioned 4 times in Scripture. And these verses, I'm going to read a couple and then I'll give you the other references. But if you go to Ezra chapter 6, verse 18. Then they appointed the priests to their divisions and the Levites in their sections for the service of God in Jerusalem, as it is written in Sefer Moshe, the book of Moses. Now, a question that we're going to have as we go along is the Sefer Moshe the same as the Sefer ha-Torah? We have to ask those questions. But we'll get to that. Go to Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 1 and 2. On that day, the book of Moses, Sefer Moshe, was read aloud as the people listened, and there was found in it that no Ammonite or Moabite was ever to enter the assembly of God. Now that tells me, by the way, that they are reading from what book? They happen to be reading from Deuteronomy there, or a form of Deuteronomy, because it's the only place that mentions that particular it's only in there in Deuteronomy it talks about the Ammonite or the Moabite, which are not to be allowed into the assembly. Then in verse 3, so when they heard the law, the Torah, they excluded all the foreigners from Israel. Now write these verses down, 2 Chronicles 25:4 and 2 Chronicles 35:12. So those passages refer to a Sefer Moshe, Moses' scroll. The Moses scroll. That'd be a good name for a book. Now, the next one is Torat Moshe. And Torah there is used with the word which follows it. So it's the teaching of Moses. And we find that in 8 verses. And I'm only going to read a couple of those. If you go with me this morning on that term to Joshua chapter 8. Joshua chapter 8 and verse 32. And he wrote there on the stones a copy, Mishneh Torah Moshe, a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. So here we have, someone is able to write the Torah of Moses. In this case, he wrote a copy of the Torat Moshe. So this is the instruction of Moses, and he writes it on stones. Now, you have to think as we work through these, how many stones would it take if the Torah of Moses mentioned here is what we typically associate with the Torah of Moses? Just keep that in your mind. All right? Now, I want you to look at 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 3. Do your duty to the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses. In the law of Moses. So again, this is the teaching of Moses, Torat Moshe. Now this, according to the text, is King David advising his son. He's on his deathbed. So listen, son, keep what is written in the Torat Moshe. Now look at 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 25. Before him, this is talking about Josiah, there was no king like him who turned to Jehovah with all his heart, all his soul, and all his might in conformity to all the Torat Moshe, the Torah of Moses, the teaching of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. All right? Now recall that King Josiah, it was in his day in 622 BCE that the scroll of Moses was discovered. It had been lost. So this king, King Josiah, according to the writer of 2 Kings 23:25, there's never been a king like him. And some of you are thinking, wait a minute, what about Hezekiah? Well, it's an interesting question. Why is it that King Hezekiah, something very similar is said about him? That's for another day. I just don't have time to do everything today. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. And let's see, verse 13. Just as it is written in the Torat Moshe, the law of Moses, the instruction of Moses, all this disaster has come on us, yet we have not sought favor of the Lord our God by turning from our wrongdoing, doing, and giving attention to your truth. This is part of a prayer. So again, it's talking about Torat Moshe, the teaching of Moses. Now write these verses down. We're not going to do these. Ezra chapter 3 verse 2 and chapter 7 verse 6 of Ezra. Ezra 3:2, Ezra 7:6, and two more. 2 Chronicles 23:18 and 2 Chronicles 30:16. All 8 of these use the phrase Torat Moshe. So now we know that there is a Sefer ha-Torah, there is a Sefer Moshe, a Torat Moshe. All of these terms are describing a document, and we have to ask ourselves, it seems pretty obvious, let me just put it this way, that all of these designations are referring to the same document, one which Moses wrote. Now, there's one other phrase, or a couple more, but one is Sefer Torat Moshe, the scroll of the teaching of Moses. Sefer Torat Moshe. And there are 4 of these, and we're going to go through these now. Scroll of the teaching of Moses, mentioned 4 times. Joshua, chapter 8. And by the way, I have these. I'm going to post a list of these. So you have these, but I just waited until the last one, and you've already written them. So it's good to write it, though, because you remember them. Joshua 8, 32. We're looking at the same verse we looked at a moment ago because it gives us a couple of different ways to look at this. And he wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses. This is the reason I'm singling these 4 out is because where before it said the instruction of Moses, now this expands it. This phrase brings in the word sefer, which is typically translated as a scroll. But I want you to not think that a scroll must be like the one in my cabinet you're not looking at, but like a Torah scroll rolled up. The word sefer actually has a wider understanding in the ancient world. It doesn't have to be on leather or papyrus. There are other ways that a sefer can be presented depending on when it was written and where it was written. But sefer means an account, which is why in modern English translations they'll translate sefer as book. Well, they didn't have books in the term like in a codex form, which is what we think when we read book. So anyway, sefer, he wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. Look at, let me see, Joshua, and 23, verse 6. Joshua 23, verse 6. Be very determined then to keep and do everything that is written in the Sefer Torat Moshe, the scroll of the teaching of Moses. Go to 2 Kings. 2 Kings 14, verse 6. We're winding down to the bottom of the list. But he did not put the sons of the murderers to death in obedience to what is written in the Sefer Torat Moshe, the scroll of the teaching of Moses, as the Lord commanded, saying, Fathers shall not be put to death for sons, nor the sons be put to death for the fathers, but each shall be put to death for his own sin. 2 Kings 14:6. And the final reading on Sefer Torat Moshe is from Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 1. You'll notice we read this earlier, but it brings in this additional word. And all the people gathered as one person at the public square, which was in front of the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, the Sefer Torat Moshe, which the Lord, Jehovah, had given to Israel. And Ezra brought the Torah before the assembly of men, etc. There is one other passage I want you to have in your notes, and it comes from the book of Malachi. Go to Malachi. In the Hebrew, it's chapter 3, verse 22. In an English Bible, it's going to be Malachi 4:4. Remember, Zikru Torat Moshe avdi. remember the Torah, the teaching of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel. So here we have, these are the terms by which a document is known to the biblical writers. Sefer ha-Torah, the scroll of instruction, occurs 10 times. Sefer Moshe, 4 times. The scroll of Moses, Sefer Moshe, scroll of Moses, 4 times. The Torat Moshe, the teaching of Moses, 8 times. The Sefer Torat Moshe, 4 times. And the Torat Moshe avdi, once. All of these texts tell me that according to the biblical writers, Moses wrote the Torah. Jews believe this, and they're right. Christians believe this, and they too are right. I believe this, and I also am right. Where we disagree, me and others, where they disagree with me, I'm certain, is in how do we define what constitutes the Torah? What constitutes that which is written by Moses and that which is not written by Moses? Now, my view is a biblical view. My view is a scriptural view. It's supported by text within the Bible. The other view is a traditional view. It is maintained against all evidence. And the people who maintain that view fall into 2 camps. They don't know, or they choose to follow tradition over evidence. Those are the 2 options. The Pentateuch, the 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, as we have them today, are generally believed to be the Torah of Moses. When people hear about the Sefer ha-Torah, they think the Pentateuch. When they hear the Sefer Moshe, the scroll of Moses, they think the Pentateuch. When they think of, or when they read or hear the Torah of Moses, they think the Pentateuch. When they hear the Sefer Torat Moshe, the scroll of the teaching of Moses, they think the Pentateuch. The biblical writers cannot be thinking the same thing. Now, how can I say that? The Pentateuch tells us, rarely, but it does mention 2 times, and 2 times only, that Moses wrote this document, a document. But it never says that Moses wrote the 5 books. Again, it's not just being nitpicky. It's scriptural. I'm trying to say, let's read what it says. Someone, not Moses, someone in Deuteronomy tells me in 3rd-person narration that Moses wrote the Torah. And I believe him. I believe that voice. I believe that hand. I want you to go with me this morning to Deuteronomy chapter 31. We're going to look at the only place in the 5 books that tells us specifically that Moses wrote the Torah. And it's not Moses speaking. Deuteronomy 31:9. Vayktov Moshe et ha-Torah hazot. And Moses wrote this Torah. And he gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, saying, and he goes into when they should read this document that he's written. But when we read these texts, we have to read them for what they say. We have to look at it and say, who's speaking here? Someone is telling us that Moses wrote this, gave it to the Levites, and then Moses, the same person, tells us that Moses then told them every 7 years you're to read this publicly. Clearly, someone other than Moses is writing this. It's the voice of a narrator. Now look with me down at verse 24. Verse 24. And it came about, verse 24, that Moses, when Moses finished writing the words of this Torah, when he finished writing Divrei ha-Torah hazot on a sefer until they were completed, that Moses commanded the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, take this sefer, take this book of the law and place it mitzad ha'aron of the covenant of the Lord your God, so that it may remain there as a witness against you. So again, I've pointed this out. I know we've talked about this. Some of you say over and over and over, and that's because it's important. The writer is telling us that Moses, at the time he completed the Torah, does Ross believe Moses wrote the Torah? Yes, you should too. And he did finish it. He wrote it to its very end, and he gave it to the Levites, and they put it in the ark. All of those are facts. But what we are reading is not that sefer. We're reading about it. You understand? The sefer that Moses wrote did not contain this. And Moses finished writing it to the very end. No, he finished writing it to the very end, but he didn't say, that's not in there. It's someone, like imagine someone's watching. I'm giving the benefit that it happened at that time. Somebody says, they're watching Moses, they're watching him. I assume he's right-handed. He's writing. He puts the pen down, and the guy, whoever's writing, man or woman, says, and when he finished writing to the very end, he just put his quill down. You know, he didn't write that part. You get it. So it's someone watching the completion of the Torah. And by the way, again, that's Deuteronomy 31. It's not, we still have 32, 33, 34. That includes stuff. It's all third person. Verse 25 says, verse 25 and 26 say that it's going to leave it there in the ark, actually mitzad, could mean beside the ark. It's not, I don't think it means inside the ark. I think it means beside it. So you have an ark here, and is it the one that Moses made in Deuteronomy 10, or the one that Bezalel and Aholiab made in Leviticus or Exodus 25, etc.? What we do know is that it's beside mitzad. Now, all of these texts that we read today tell us, nay, confirm that Moses wrote a Torah. The question becomes, and this has been the general flow, the meaning behind our deep dive has been, what evidence stands forth to suggest what was in that scroll and what was not in that scroll that Moses wrote? That's the question. See, the Bible describes a lot of different works that we no longer have. How many of you have on your bookshelf the book of the wars of the Lord? Now, if somebody says, yes, it's not the one I'm talking about. I'm talking about the one that's mentioned in the biblical text, the book of the wars of the Lord, right? This is an ancient source that the compiler of the Pentateuch said, I'm going to pull that in, and I'm glad they did. But we don't have the book of the wars of the Lord. The book of Jasher. Now, some of you are saying, I do have that. No, you don't. You have a book called the book of Jasher, but I'm talking about the authentic book of Jasher that ancient writers mention and use as a source book. This ancient material. So the biblical writers often incorporate elements, sometimes passages from ancient works into their works, but they're not that work. Those are mentioned in a way that a person is referring to that work, just like the Pentateuch refers to the book that Moses wrote, the scroll that Moses wrote. The writers tell us about the Sefer Moshe, the Sefer this, they tell us about it, but it's not it. The same Bible, the same text that we went through, but the same scriptural text give us hints, perhaps more than hints, arguably about what it contained. An analysis of the text of the Bible make it possible to determine with a really strong degree of certainty what was in and what wasn't, right? And that's been one of the main drivers for what we've worked on thus far. Now, here are my takeaways. When someone says, well, what did Moses not write? Because that's a big statement. Because especially if your traditional view is that Moses wrote all of Genesis 1 through Deuteronomy 34:12, here's what I say Moses didn't write. You ready? Third person narration. You say all of that? He didn't write any of that. That's a lot of material. That's a lot of material. Now, I know that there are people who will be challenged by that and who disagree with that. But he did not write the third person material. And let me tell you, within the 5 books, Moses is mentioned 592 times. 592 times. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, and Moses and Aaron did this, and Moses and Aaron. Now, again, we're talking about authorship. Stick with me. Someone other than Moses wrote about Moses extensively. Now, remember, we're excluding Genesis in this. Genesis is a separate case because we don't meet Moses until Exodus, right? So I'm really talking about 592 times between Exodus and the end of Deuteronomy, Moses is mentioned. And I say Moses didn't write those things. Only in Deuteronomy, by the way, do we have any first-person narration at all. And I find that to be quite compelling. I find that to be fascinating. And by the way, Deuteronomy mentions Moses 38 times. But within Deuteronomy, not Deuteronomy as a whole, but within Deuteronomy, there are pieces of first-person narration. Now, what I have proposed in my book, The Moses Scroll, and in my teaching in various classes, that the writer of Deuteronomy had at his or her disposal various sources, as did those who pulled together the Pentateuch. But Deuteronomy in particular, the writer of Deuteronomy, the final compiler, had, I believe, a scroll that Moses wrote and other materials, third-person narration. These two could be ancient, they can be authentic, they can be true. Hear me, they can be true, but these other elements are combined. Moses, by the way, just if you want this in your notes, I created a little chart for me to keep it straight. Moses is mentioned in chapters 1, 4, 5, 27, 29, 31, 32, 33, and 34. So, but within Deuteronomy, again, there is this first-person narration. We find in Deuteronomy a mixture, though, first and third. And similarly, we see that in the prophets as well. We see, for instance, in the book of Daniel, we open up to Daniel, and if you read chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's all third-person narration. But we do have some of Daniel that's in first-person narration. And I think it's the way that the writers will incorporate, it leads off, chapter 7 leads off with this in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel, see it's third person, saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and told the following summary of it. Now guess what follows? A first person account. Now did the compiler of Daniel pull in this account from the hand of Daniel? He says, I was looking in my vision by night. See, if the third person narration would have continued, it would have said, Daniel said that he was looking in a vision by night, and he saw these things. But this is like someone actually has the letter that Daniel wrote. Daniel recorded this vision, and the compiler of Daniel pulled that into this book of Daniel as we have it. We see other first-person narration throughout the Bible. It's not like someone might say, well, Ross, you're overstating the case, because third-person narration is the way that the ancient writers wrote. And I would say, not so. How about the Mesha stone? How about the Moabite stone? I, King Mesha. Do they know how to write in the first person? Absolutely, they know how to write. The book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah. Nehemiah uses first-person narration. Deuteronomy uses some first-person narration, and we see it throughout the biblical text. Third-person narration just throws a flag and says, the person that is being talked about here did not write this text. It's just that simple. We have to be able to notice this, and perhaps even more importantly, we have to be willing to admit that third-person narration indicates the hand, the voice of someone other than the person being spoken of in that text. Now, people speculate, scholars speculate, various authors speculate, some of us may speculate, who is the writer who wrote this? Do we know? Well, no, we don't know. Some will say this scribal school of so-and-so updated the text or whatever. But you know what? That's just an idea. It's a theory. It has no biblical basis at all. There's no one who can show that a certain school of scribes did these things, because there's no biblical evidence for it. Now, for those who don't mind not having a biblical theory, that's a theory to take. But I want to look at the text, and what I come away with is we may never know the identity of the scribe or the editor or the redactor of these texts. We may not know who did that. But we can tell what is most likely by the hand of Moses or Daniel or Nehemiah or Isaiah or Jeremiah or Hosea, Joel, Amos, Nahum. We can find first-person material and then notice around it the later enhancements to the text, you might say, the scribal additions become obvious to our eyes. And I think that's important. Again, last week I pointed out we had this idea that I said one thing that's generally understood is that dead people don't write. So whenever you look at the death of Moses, I said he very assuredly did not write that about his own death and burial. But others have said that he did, and I don't think it's just not going to hold water. But some people say, well, Joshua wrote that. So they get these theories again. Now, where do they get that? They want to make, they know it's obvious that Moses didn't write it. So they go, who's the next person that I can grab onto and say that person did it, because somehow they feel that bolsters their faith. So they say, well, it has to be Joshua then. But Joshua's mentioned in the third person too, so he didn't write it either. So we have to be willing to look at these things and use some common sense. Now, anachronism is something we've talked a lot about over the last 52 weeks. Anachronism, again, is a flag. It tells us this was written later. It's not by a contemporary writer. And there are some examples of that. And I'm going to give you just some of the biggies, just so you have them in your notes fresh. So if you see, here's one flag that I see sometimes. If you see the word "to this day," generally, I don't want to say all the time, but probably, but most of the time, when the text is flowing along and giving you a narrative which is set in a certain time, and it says "to this day," that is often a clue that a non-contemporary writer, someone who is not there at the time of the event they're writing about, is now inserting themselves into the text, indicating to us that the text is written at a later period than the event described. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Two, in fact. Go to Exodus chapter 16. This is one of the stronger points for this particular subject. Exodus 16, verse 35. Now it says, "And the sons of Israel ate the manna for 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan." Now an omer is a tenth of an ephah. The children of Israel ate manna for 40 years. Now, why do I have a problem with that particular text? Well, I don't have a problem with it, but why do I suggest that this wasn't written by Moses, A, nor in the time of Moses, B? Because the writer of this text tells us that manna was eaten for 40 years in the wilderness until they crossed the border into the land of Canaan. Now, guess what? Moses is dead before they cross into the land of Canaan, number one. And number two, Exodus 16 is telling us that they ate it for 40 years, but this isn't even year two in the chronological flow of things. They've not even made it to Sinai yet. So we just have to say, now, do I believe that they ate manna for 40 years? The text says that they ate manna for 40 years. My point is, this was updated by a later scribe. What school of scribes? We don't know. No one knows. Now, we have certain evidences, but we just don't know for sure. It would only be someone's theory or idea to plug a name in. Now, geography, no, let me do one more anachronism. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 2, Deuteronomy 2, verse 12. The Horites previously lived in Seir, but the sons of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled in their place, just as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave them. What's the clue there? It's telling us, somebody who wrote this is telling us that, hey, you know how Israel conquered and inhabited the land of Canaan? And the reader says, yes, I know that. And then you ought to say, but you shouldn't know it yet. Not yet. They hadn't crossed into the land. So my point being that the writer is writing outside of this period of time, and he wants to tell us that just like the Horites lived in Seir, but Esau dispossessed them, the writer is writing later and he goes, you know, the same way Israel dispossessed the inhabitants of Canaan. But he's telling on himself. We shouldn't know that yet. The conquest of Canaan doesn't happen until Joshua, the book of Joshua. Again, one of the clear indicators is to check the geography. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1 through 5. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness, etc. This writer, this narrator, if you will, the narrator's voice of Deuteronomy 1 through 5, says that these are the words that Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan. So this is a telltale. Not only do we know that the writer is not Moses because it's third person, we know that he's writing after the day, and he's writing from Cisjordan, we call it, not Transjordan, Cisjordan. He's writing from the land of Canaan. He's referring to something that Moses did on the other side of the Jordan. So again, we have evidence. We have to be looking at evidence, and we have to be willing and able to accept that a writer, not Moses, and not of Moses' time, is giving us information and context as it was understood at the time it was written. A couple of other quick examples to underscore some of this. You know, we know for a fact that we read in the Pentateuch that Moses is the most humble man, but generally most humble men don't write, you know, that they're the most humble men. It's not that I doubt that Moses was the meekest man on all the earth, but it's just that I don't see the meekest man in all the earth writing that he's the meekest man. It's someone else is telling us this. That's the way you want it. Like if I said, I'm the best teacher, whatever, that could be argued, obviously. But if someone else says, hey, he's the best teacher, you see the difference. It's a little bit, you shouldn't blow your own trumpet like that. Anyway. And then again, the death and burial. Here's the deal. The unnamed author of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and most of Deuteronomy, please get this, speak of Moses the same exact way that the writer of Genesis speaks of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Esau, Hagar, Avimelech. You see, it's a writer writing about these people, just like we have a writer writing about Moses and about Aaron and about Elisheva. All of these people. Whenever the evidence is put forward and presented and read at value of the face, just looking at it, studying it, and considering it, evidence of the majority of Scripture, particularly when we're talking about the Pentateuch, conflicts with the view that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. It's that simple. The same evidence reveals not only that Moses is not the author of the majority of what we have in the Pentateuch, that he personally didn't write that, but that it was written at another time. There is ample evidence that much of this is written into its form that we now have it, I should say, much later. But get this. Moses, according to what we read in the Pentateuch and the entire Bible, Moses did write a Torah. He did. And let me tell you what would be in it. First of all, and I believe we have traces of this in the Pentateuch, just like we have a trace of the book of the wars of the Lord. I don't have the book of the wars of the Lord, but I have one interesting passage from the book of the wars of the Lord. The book of the wars of the Lord is older than the text in the Pentateuch which speaks about it. Because the writer, you get what I'm saying? The writer of that text, it says, hey, I have the book of the wars of the Lord here, and I'm writing this story about the children of Israel in the wilderness, and when they cross over and there's the Wadi Arnon, and I'm going to quote, here it is, in the book of the wars of the Lord. I'm going to include that in my writing. This book of the wars of the Lord is the earlier source that the writer of the biblical account is using. Now, the way I'm describing the Torah that Moses wrote, it seems like the way it's presented, there is an ancient scroll that the writer, the compiler of the Pentateuch, is pulling in. One of the sources is the book of the wars of the Lord. Another source is, I have some old scroll fragments here, and I'm going to include parts of the scroll of Moses. Now, what's going to be different when I pull this text into my document, the Pentateuch? I'm working on the Pentateuch. How are you? I'm the editor of the Pentateuch. And I'm going to include in my work bits of the scroll of Moses. Normally in my writing, I talk about the scroll of Moses. I say, and Moses wrote a scroll. But when I quote parts of the original Moses scroll here, it's interesting. For the first time, it changes to first person. And we see it. We go, wow, I feel something when I read that. It's and the Lord spoke unto me and said, you've been here at this mountain long enough. Turn. And we did this, and we did that. Whereas normally when I'm writing the Pentateuch, I say, and the children of Israel went into the valley of... But this document that I'm now using as a source, it says, and we crossed the border. You realize that that is only in Deuteronomy? It's never worded like that in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and most of Deuteronomy. But at times you get this authentic source peeks through. And we did this, and we did that. I put my book of the wars of the Lord back. Y'all didn't know I had that. The original scroll that Moses wrote the Torah. He did. And the writers of the Pentateuch tell us he did. And the writers of the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim confirm that Moses wrote a scroll of the teaching. There is a scroll of the teaching of Moses and so forth. And it was written in the first person. And it would have lacked anachronism. There would not be signs of anachronism, which is clearly something written at a later time pulled in. Why? Because in that original scroll, it was the contemporary writer. It was Moses writing in his day. And we get traces of that. It would have been much shorter. When he finished his scroll and he gives it to the Levites, he says, and someone else is writing about this account, by the way. And we have this account in Deuteronomy 31. Hallelujah, we have this account. But Moses didn't write it. Someone else wrote it. So Moses he finishes writing, this guy, or whoever's writing, scribe is taking note, and he goes, take the Levites, listen to me. You paying attention? Take this, put it mitzad aron, the ark. Put it beside the ark and keep it there. It's going to be a witness against you one day. And look, here's something else I want you to know. You see, this is the scroll. What I want you to do is, I want you every 7 years, somebody else is writing this down. Every 7 years, it's Sukkot, right? You know, during Sukkot, I want you to get together, everybody, men, women, children, everybody, and you're going to read this scroll aloud during the year of release. Every 7 years, you're going to read it aloud. And they say, okay. And also, when you cross over into the land of Canaan, I'm not going to be with you. When you cross over, you're going to write the words of ha-Torah hazot, this teaching, on the stones. Now again, I've said this before, but imagine if the scribe is watching him like, look, I'm going to do this. He's going to be like, if he's holding up, you know, a big Torah scroll, and he goes, you're going to write this on stones when you cross over. Imagine, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, he would be like, what? You want me to write the whole thing on stones? It's a scroll of Moses. The writers of the Pentateuch know about it. The writers of the Ketuvim, the writers of the prophets and the writing, everybody has heard about this scroll that Moses wrote. Would have been much shorter. When they read it aloud to the people, we have an example where a scroll of Moses was read to the people in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And it says they read the scroll, and it's from morning to midday with commentary. It takes about 20 some odd hours to read the entire Pentateuch. Now what people do though is they go, well, they didn't read it all. They just read, snippets. That's not what it says. We have to be willing to weigh the evidence. It would have been much shorter. It could be read aloud in a morning. Now, at some point, the Torah that Moses wrote, the one that the writers of the Pentateuch tell us about, they tell us a lot. Some are much later, but we get a lot of information from the Pentateuch. They tell us that Moses wrote this Torah and that Moses died and was buried. And, the tragedy is that scroll that Moses wrote was forsaken, forgotten, and lost. How do you lose the scroll that Moses wrote? Now we want to have in our mind that everybody's packing it around with them everywhere they go. They get on the, they go on the caravan, they do this, they're in the old city, everybody's walking around with their scroll of Moses, and they're going to synagogue service on Shabbat throughout the biblical period, and they're all following that's not what the Bible says. It's a history of departing from the way, from just you've forsaken. God, over and over and over, He raises His prophets from morning to, you know what they say? You've forsaken my ways. You've forsaken, you've forsaken, you've forsaken. You've gone after that which your heart desires. You haven't pursued what I put for you. I mean, we find out that they actually lost the scroll. The most important document ever written, the scroll that Moses wrote was lost. Now, it was rediscovered, as you know, and this is just a quick wind-up, in 622 BCE. The scroll would be 800 or 900 years old at that point. It was discovered in the time of Josiah by a priest by the name of Hilkiah. This was in the days of one prophet by the name of Jeremiah, who was the son of a priest named Hilkiah. Wait a minute. Priest named Hilkiah finds the scroll in the days of a prophet named Jeremiah, who is the son of a priest named Hilkiah. Could they be connected? Perhaps. Jeremiah says that when that scroll was found, he ate it, meaning he devoured the words of that scroll that was found, which was the scroll that Moses wrote, which had been lost. He ate it, and you know what he said? His preaching becomes a little bit different than the average person on the street. He goes in the courts of the temple and he questions the validity of the temple and the sacrificial cult. He goes so far in the days of the discovery of the original Moses scroll, which he ate. Jeremiah goes so far as to say, on behalf of God, sacrifice and eat your meat. For in the day that I called you out of the land of Egypt, I never spoke to you concerning sacrifice and offering. But this is what I said, obey my voice. Jeremiah, the son of the priest Hilkiah, in the days of the discovery of the scroll that Moses wrote by a priest named Hilkiah from Anatot, he ate that scroll. He challenged the validity of the priesthood. He challenged the validity of the temple sacrificial cult. And he said this, who are we to say that we are wise and the Torah of Jehovah is with us, when in fact the lying pen of the scribes has made it into a lie? Now, I know that people don't like that verse, and I can promise you that the priesthood didn't like what Jeremiah had to say. I can guarantee you that the fundamentalists in 622 BCE were ready to choke Jeremiah down and kill him. And you know what? It says that. They wanted to kill him. Why? Because he challenged the traditional view. There are people out in the world today who think they're doing the right thing by defending traditions that aren't supported by evidence. Now, for me, I want to know the truth. I want to go where the evidence leads. Whenever I read Jeremiah, it brings me back into the world where a real case is presented before the people of that time. They had a Torah, but when the real one was discovered, and that's what happened, it revealed the falsehood in the one they thought. You thought, Jeremiah 8:8. Who are we to say that we're wise and the Torah of the Lord is with us, when in fact the lying pen of the scribes has made it a lie? Perhaps what is needed then, because I'm now pulled into this world, I feel pulled into this world that Jeremiah found himself in. Jeremiah, perhaps what is needed is a study. I'm talking a deep dive into the words of the prophet Jeremiah and into the time towards the end of the temple period, the biblical period, the first temple period, before the Babylonians came in, and maybe we need to go in and study the words of Jeremiah and the times that he lived. My present leaning is to do just that. That our next study is to go into a full study of the prophets, beginning with Jeremiah. Now, I'm going to be praying about this while I'm in the land and thinking about all of these things, because this concludes the Pentateuch, A New Look series. But we're going to roll right into something else just as exciting, just as biblical. And we're going to rely on the Scripture, and we'll be respectful of tradition, because we don't want to be just mean. But I'm telling you, we're going to look at things, and we're going to look at them closely, and we're going to work through the text, and we're going to come up with solutions that fit the evidence. So I will give you more information on the upcoming series on Jeremiah, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, don't miss next Saturday morning. Dave and Patty Tyler are going to be presenting, and we're going to be doing some tests to make sure that we can make all the technology work. So that's all coming this week too. So if you see us go live, you see Dave and Patty, maybe you can help us out with some of these tests. We would appreciate it. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Have a beautiful week, and look forward to coming to you live from the land over the next 30 some odd days. Shabbat Shalom.